In this series, I'm describing some of the stories that came up for me in my sabbatical leave this past summer, including, so far we're just along El Camino de Santiago, the French way, in northern Spain. And we've been talking about saints and angels and public witness. And I want to spend a little more time on that today. We've talked about it in many ways, including Saint Mary, the Mother of our Lord. We've talked about the public witness of the cathedral in Burgos celebrating their 800th anniversary and our upcoming 50th anniversary. And what does that look like in terms of a celebration and a public witness and some other things? So last time I described coming to the church in Orneos, right after the little hermitage of St. Bridget in Sweden. I came down a hill into the town of Orneos, and there was this unique setup for pilgrims. You can see just a place prepared for prayer with Jesus and Mary and 20th century peacemakers from all lands and traditions. And wanted to talk about, we looked at some of them last time, and I wanted to point out some of them today. We think that upper left is the Dalai Lama. Why would he be up there as a person to consider in a time of prayer? Why do you think?
I believe, and I'm not entirely certain, that the Dalai Lama is a leader of, I don't remember the exact path.
Tibetan Buddhism.
And enlightenment.
Uh-huh.
And I think I did some personal reading on some of that, and it's not so much a religion, but more of well, the way it was presented, it wasn't presented as a religion as much as it was presented as a way to find peace. And there are numerous different ways, and of course, some of them, those who go to the monastery, they try to give up everything, but all physical connection and desire for things. But there are other books for just regular people that live regular lives that, of course, own things, and it's more about not prioritizing that sort of thing as a way to find inner peace.
Thank you. Definitely. And so there's before Archbishop Tutu died. Now he and the Dalai Lama were good friends, and the last time they got together with a journalist who sat there and asked some questions and then listened to their conversation and wrote it up in something called the Book of Joy. And I recommend it if you're looking for a wonderful dialogue between two spiritual leaders from other parts of the world. It's just delightful. So that second man, I don't know who that is. Then the next woman is named Lema Gbowie, who is Lutheran, from Liberia. And there was a terrible civil war in Liberia in the, I believe in the 1990s. And, all war is terrible. But what makes civil war sort of uniquely awful?
It's apart families.
It tears apart families, communities. People, divide up on other sides and start killing each other. And it's so dreadful. And Lema recognized that she did not want to see another son, nephew, father murdered in her family or in her community. And other women were having this conversation too, like, we're done. There might be real differences here, but we do not want to lose our sons, our husbands, our family brothers, family members to conflict in this way. And so they started gathering in mass protests, wearing white, the women wearing white. And it wasn't getting them very far. The killing continued. And the women were representing both sides of this civil conflict, right? So that in itself was something, that they were able to come together, even though there had been bloodshed. They were spiritually willing enough to set that aside, to work together to end this killing and this war. But just mass protests weren't doing it. So they decided that they would have an action, a shared action that they would all agree to. They told their husbands they would not have sex with them until the war was over.
Was it over the next day?
And they continued to mass protest in white. And the war ended. And she didn't describe all the details of that, but she was a very inspirational speaker at one of our ELCA National Youth Gatherings around early 2000 to talk with the youth about what it means to put your faith in action, to put something yourself and something on the line for the sake of God's work in the world. So. Then Mohandas Gandhi, also called the Mahatma in India, well-known leader of peaceful nonviolent resistance as India was working toward independence from the British Empire and led a peaceful march to the sea. I don't know who the next one is. Does someone else?
I said that last time. She said that wasn't right.
No.
Right? Isn't that what you said? Cesar Chavez.
No, I don't believe it's Cesar Chavez, but possibly. I mean, he would earn a place there, right?
Yeah.
Whether or not he's there. The next one, I think, is Stanley Rother, who was a priest from rural Oklahoma, a big strapping farm boy, who was sent to Oklahoma, and in the 1970s, there was a terrible civil war in Guatemala. And he was sent to a community where there were a lot of people being killed, including, now the Guatemalan church was organizing for peace and for, the uplift of the poor in the country. And so pretty soon, the right-wing killing squads started coming for the catechists, the teachers of the faith in the Catholic churches. And so he started having catechists of his church be murdered, as well as other leaders. And some urged him to flee because they had seen his name on the list, but he said, the shepherd should not flee in times of danger. And so he himself in 1981 was martyred. And he's recognized as a martyr in the Catholic Church. And I've been to that little community by Lake Atitlan in Guatemala, where there's a shrine to Father Stanley Rother. Yes?
Weren't there 3 nuns killed during that conflict? 3 nuns were killed during that conflict.
Mm-hmm.
And he sort of stood up for it.
Yeah.
Killed himself.
Yeah. And also in El Salvador, there were similar, not exactly the same. The next one, does anyone know
Just real quick.
Yeah.
I don't know for sure.
Oh,
but that's
that does
awfully close.
That does look like Cesar Chavez. Okay, let's go back one and talk about Cesar Chavez. Why would he be up there? I apologize for putting that one down too soon. Why would Cesar Chavez be lifted up from our country?
Human rights.
Human rights. What kind of human rights?
Well, so for the farm workers, so.
He organized farm workers, especially in our state of California, around health and safety, for one. There were exposures to pesticides and other things that were shortening the lives of many farm workers. There were also inadequate facilities. They didn't have dignity in their place of labor often. And so he and others, including Dolores Huerta, began the United Farm Workers Movement. And he did so again from a place of deep faith. Did any of you remember Father Eugene Boyle, who was here for a while? He was the senior pastor at St. Catherine's Parish. And in his younger days, he was a pilot. In his younger days, he would fly Cesar around. So I heard stories of Father Boyle taking Cesar where he needed to be to do that work.
There's something in Gilroy about Dolores Huerta. I think it's a whole museum display.
Yeah, she was a speaker last weekend at an event there. Mm-hmm.
It'll be there for a few weeks, I believe.
Or maybe a couple weekends ago. Anyway, yeah. Does anyone know Rigoberta Menchú? Also from Guatemala, is best known as someone who worked for the rights of indigenous peoples. In Guatemala, they were those most suffering during the Civil War, and traditionally those who had the least access in society, whether it be through trade, through healthcare, through education. She, in later years, campaigned for healthcare for all, lower prescription drug prices so people who were ill could have access to medications they needed, and was recognized by UNESCO as a worldwide champion of indigenous rights and is a Nobel Peace Prize winner herself. A good person to learn more about. And then the next one I mentioned in preaching this morning, Wangari Maathai from Kenya. Malala Yousafzai, you know her story? She was shot in the head because she had been seeking access to education for girls in Pakistan. And those who were opposing that, again, so many of these put themselves on the line for the dignity and rights of themselves and others like them, or others that they saw who needed that in their world. Martin Luther King Jr., again from our country, civil rights leader as well as pastor, who did this from a place of faith and hope. I do not know who the next two are. I believe that this is a nun next to Martin Luther King Jr., but I don't know her or her story or the boy. I think the next one is Thich Nhat Hanh, who is a Vietnamese Buddhist leader and teacher, participant in civil rights movements in this country and in others. Anti-war, and also a spiritual teacher of renown. Saint or Mother Teresa of Calcutta in India, what was she known for? Care of the poor.
Especially with AIDS or dying.
Particularly those who are dying. She led the Sisters of Charity in picking up the dying from the streets of Kolkata. I should have spelled it the new way, not Kolkata. Archbishop Desmond Tutu from South Africa, who is well known for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission following apartheid and all of his anti-apartheid work before that. And then Charles Foucault of France, who is a spiritual teacher and a mystic. So anyway, we could probably name others, but talking about stories along the way. These are human stories that demonstrate, again, God at work in the world, um, in our own time and in, the decades just before us. It's an invitation to not only think about, well, what was God doing with Moses, but also where's God of the Christian faith for you? Then which famous person from the last 100 years from another faith tradition other than Christianity as an important model of true humanity for you? So talk about those two questions, and maybe about, not only talking here, but sharing stories along the way and thinking about, who else can you talk to about someone who's been an important model or person of faith in your life. So go ahead and begin your conversations. I will give you 10 minutes, if you need that much time, for everyone to talk about, tell the stories of who's important to you. I'm going to call us back together and invite, if there are names that you would like to lift that were shared as important, famous people, both Christian tradition and maybe other faith traditions, who are important to you, that you might think about talking with others about.
Well, I want to share Rick's story since he had to leave.
Okay.
Okay, which I thought was particularly interesting. His grandparents, grandparents from South Dakota came out in 1958 when they were living in Riverside.
Yes.
And maybe he's told you the story. But anyway, they were on the bus with this distinguished black man. That was Martin Luther King.
Wow.
And they think it was because he was on his way to the Southern Baptist Convention that was taking place in Southern California.
So where was the bus coming from?
They were coming from South
So
Dakota.
all the way from South Dakota
Right.
to California.
They're from northeastern South Dakota, towards Minnesota.
Thank you.
They came by bus.
Yeah.
Wow.
I thought that was particularly interesting.
Thank you.
Consequently, Martin Luther King and Mahatma Gandhi were the two that we talked about.
Great, yeah. And Gandhi was a mentor to Martin Luther King Jr. in the practice of nonviolent resistance and nonviolent resistance as a way of social change. The idea being, when something's terribly broken and needs to change, civil war is one option, right? But it's terrible. In nonviolent resistance, there's still suffering, but people willingly undertake pain and suffering in order that when the change comes, you're brothers and sisters and siblings, and you're not blood enemies. So there's still the need for forgiveness, but the thought is, I don't want to make someone my enemy. I want to make them my kin. And so anyway, that's Gandhi was an important teacher. Gandhi has studied many faiths and religions, and he said, I love your Christ, I just don't love your Christians. He saw so often that Christianity was used as a justification for taking away the dignity and rights of some people. And couldn't abide that, but he loved Jesus. So he never identified as a Christian, but definitely felt an affinity toward Christ. And understood, that some of us view the cross of Christ partially through that lens of nonviolent resistance to empire and to oppression and to religious corruption and to all manner of evil. It exposes the thoughts and hearts of many, as the Gospel of Luke says. That sort of thing. What about others? Other names? Yes.
our conversation evolved, we started out mentioning some names, but evolved to the thing that the people who influence us more are the ones that we interact with in our early lives, especially
Okay.
teachers, grandparents, things like that. And so it wasn't famous people,
Okay.
but the bigger influence is people that we're really interacting with.
Do you tell those stories very often about influences in your life and why? So I think part of this is to encourage us to share these wonderful stories more, whether they're about the personal influences or about the historical figures from here and around the world, because that's part of our faith sharing, right? Saying, here's how God was acting in this person and in this community. And it actually creates some great conversations, right? And invites others to sort of reflect on where is God having a story right now. It's a little easier in hindsight. I mean, many of those people have been were reviled in their time. Martin Luther King Jr. was not popular in the mid to late 1960s. He had more people who disliked him than who liked him. His popularity numbers were tanked because there were some things he wasn't going to play to, create sort of goodwill if it meant that justice was delayed. He would say justice delayed is justice denied. Time for change.
His stand against the war in Vietnam, that was
That
major
in
factor.
particular created a lot of enemies for him. The stand against the war in Vietnam. J. Edgar Hoover had a big old file on him. So anyway, okay. Well, let's keep sharing the stories. So I got to Hornios, kind of midday, had lunch, had prayer, and then kept walking through countryside like this to a town called Castro Jerez. So this was a long walking day, about 17 miles. And part of it was, this is a little village of Castro Jerez, and I looked for my place to stay through booking.com, and it brought me to a campground. So I looked around and, okay, I don't have a tent. I don't quite understand, but, I double checked, looked around the corner, no, this is the address. So, I found the proprietors of the campground and said, I don't understand, I think this is the address for my reservation. And they said, oh, we have 4 kind of mobile homes that are set up that we put up as like hotel rooms on the site that can be rented. So you've got one of those. Oh, okay. Bed and bathroom. That's what I want. And so I went to check in, as usual, you pull out your passport, and my passport wasn't there. And if you've traveled overseas, one of the things you don't want to have happen to you is lose your passport. It makes it pretty hard to move around in the country. Also, even to return to this country. So when you're ready to do that. And it was a man and his wife who were running the campground. They were at this big lunch counter. And she immediately went into the mode. They only spoke Spanish. Oh, it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. And I said, it's okay. I'm not freaking out, but I'm concerned. I need to find this. So I'm retracing my steps. And I said,
17 miles of retracing.
right? So I was in a pickle. because I didn't have more steps left in me at that point. And I thought, okay, I always have been keeping my passport with my credential. And you take out the little credential, I didn't bring it in today, but to stamp at various places. So I last did that at that church in Orneos. So I said, I wonder if, they were together in my little Ziploc bag. I wonder if I left my passport there. Can you help me call a taxi to take me back to Orneos so I can look and see? And the man said, I'll drive you. I said, really? Really? Wow. And he said, yeah, just give me a minute. And so he pulled up this beat up old white car, pulled it around.
Is his name Gabriel?
Yeah.
So we started talking, his name is Gabriel, married to Maria. And he's from Asturias, which is the region in Spain my sister-in-law is from. He says, oh yeah, Spain is just Asturias and then the Reconquista, because Asturians are very proud country folk who say, we were we were the beginning of the Reconquista in 722, reconquering Spain from the Moors that took centuries, but it kind of went out from there. So anyway, we were talking. He drove me back to Orneos, and as I'm getting out of the car, approaching this church in Orneos, a couple approached me and said, "Are you looking for a passport?" Yes, I am. And so I went to Gabrielle. I said, thank you so much. This might take a little while. I'll find a way back. There's a bar over here. I'll help. He says, no, I'll just hang out and see what happens here. It's okay. And so then they said, well, they had actually gone to every hostel they could find in that town and compared it to the guest registry to see if they could, and it didn't line up with anyone who was registered at any of those places. And so they turned it into the Guardia Civil, the police. And so they said, they have it, the police have it. And so why don't you go to that bar over there, that's where we called the Guardia Civil, and call them and tell them you need it. So I said, okay, I will. And then I said, Gabriel, this is gonna take a while, go ahead. And he said, no, I'm just gonna, if La Guardia Civil's coming, they'll give me a ticket for parking here. So I'm gonna go find somewhere else to park. But I can wait. And so I went to the bar. The couple went on their way. So I went to the bar and called, and they said, we'll be there in about half an hour. And these two young men came out and, said, are you looking for your passport? Yes, and they looked at it, they looked at me. Now, I mean, in the Spanish Civil War, La Guardia Civil were killers, but today they are part of civil society, and they're actually the violent crime as well as police violence are all quite low in Spain today. So they gave that to me, and then I went over and found where Gabriel was, and he said, I'll bring the car back around. And, so he did. He drove me back, took me back to the counter with my passport in hand, checked me in, and then drove me, because you saw there was a big hill, and partway up that hill was where these trailers were. So he, with my big backpack, he says, no, I'll drive you up. And he checked me in, gave me the keys, and as he's leaving, I said, this is him. said, Gabrielle, you really are an angel. And he said, no, archangel. And then he said, think about it. Gabriel had a very delicate mission. He was sent by God, and this is all in Spanish. He was sent by God to Mary to tell her this very delicate thing. And she easily could have kicked him out. Said, I don't understand. No way. Go find someone else. But he accomplished his mission. Gabriel said, today, my mission wasn't that difficult.
Not that different.
Good story.
That's so cool.
And I was so touched by that, and also by that, you know, he understood the story of the Annunciation that was part of his namesake. And he imagined, I think, that every day God might be sending him on a mission.
Right. Sounds as though he had that in mind.
He, you know, and he just very naturally explained that. And I thought, yeah, I'm in a different world here in Spain. Like, I can't, even amongst Christians, I can barely imagine that someone would just, they wouldn't say, I'm going to tell you my faith story. He just told it, you know? He just said, oh, here's what Gabriel did. Oh, my mission wasn't so difficult today. And so I think that's part of what has inspired me with stories along the way, is how can we all see stories in our lives as part of God's story? Because they are. And so I'm going to give you 2 minutes of quiet to consider any event from your life that you could tell as a part of God's story. Maybe you bring in a character from the Bible, or a saint from history, or one of your teachers of faith in the way you tell the story. Maybe you compare it to Mary, or Ruth, or Noah, or, you know what I mean? Something like that. So I'm going to give you 2 minutes of quiet to consider, and we're just playing here. We're just playing the storytelling. So don't worry, you're with friends. But think about that for yourself, and then we'll invite some sharing. So I hope that I hope we'll keep sharing stories, not only in this format, but with each other as a church, and that this might make us bolder to just naturally share stories a little more with our family members. Young adults and kids might roll their eyes, or grandkids, but it's those stories that remain, whether or not they seem like they're listening. I want to encourage you to share stories, especially stories of faith, also with coworkers. It's like it's not, I know that there are lines to be walked, but we each have stories, and we have a public faith, and I think sometimes we overcorrect because we don't want to be obnoxious Christians. But there's this real witness to offer, right? And I know I'm not offended if a Muslim friend says, "Oh, I was just so at peace after my prayer today. It's like that, no skin off my nose. I celebrate with them, right? So I think we sometimes can put the shoe on the other foot in terms of sharing our stories a little more boldly and more often, because it's really that invitation. I share my story, you share yours. I'm not trying to twist anyone's arm. Now, the faith has been used in sometimes in places, yes, in oppressive ways, in colonizing ways, but at its heart, that's not what our faith is. So, once in a while, we get to see people and thank them. So the next day I ran across the Danish couple and said, "You're the ones who tracked down the passport, right?" And so I got to tell them more how things went and thank them. And they didn't want a lot of thanks, but they were happy to sort of hear the end of the story, and I was happy to hear theirs.
They probably tell that story.
Yeah.
Did you tell them about Gabriel?
Oh, yeah. Oh, most certainly. And they were part of that story as well. So, these are just some reflection questions as we go. What helps us see our lives as living out God's story every minute of every day? What hinders us from seeing our lives in this way? And what can we do individually and as a church to cultivate that holy imagination? So go in peace and hope. And thank you for being part of the stories along the way. Next Sunday, we're doing Christmas caroling. And instead of this, and then the following Sunday, we'll resume.
Thank you.